Hello everyone, this is Dr. Winkler. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, I hope this is a great day. I'll tell you from where I'm sitting, not standing, wherever I'm sitting, this is a great day for history. And I'm looking forward to this quite a bit. As you know, I'm Dr. Winkler. This is lecture number 3 for the Ancient Civilization course. And we're talking about the early development of civilization. As I was discussing last time, we were talking about a few places where we could find evidence of early civilization. Remember last time I mentioned Catalhuyuk, which I thought had some umlauts involved? Well, if you go to Wikipedia, there's a few umlauts involved. Now, why is the settlement Catalhuyuk? Probably because there's obsidian nearby, and that's a very good form of stone that we can use to make tools. I made a big deal about Jarmo last time. Let me get that in front here. I made a big deal about Jarmo last time. Jarmo is in Iraq, Mesopotamia at that time. And Jarmo you can see, well, not so well, it's up here. It is in a very central location. We look at Jarmo as a very important site. Archaeologists have been there and they've taken a very good look at this and done a number of excavations, and they're saying, my goodness, this gives us a good taproot into understanding what's going on at that time. We do assume sometimes that the cities develop certain advances, including technology, and then it spreads to other places. The archaeological record gives us some indication that the technical advances can come from a number of places, but then they kind of coalesce, they all come together in the cities. Remember, Jarmo is important to help us understand the domestication of animals, when they were there, and the kind of technology that's available. Well, we have to ask ourselves a question. We are talking about the development of cities. And that is, when you have cities, you get a complex political and social organization. You have to have this simply to survive. You see, in Mesopotamia, this is true of Egypt as well, but Mesopotamia is perhaps a better example. You have farms that are not just along the river. There's a trouble with having your farm right along the river, because when the river rises, goes up and down, you're going to have a problem. You might lose your crops and things might get washed out. So there's a tendency to have settlements back a few hundred yards. And as you get more people, you can go many hundreds of yards, thousands of yards. In fact, sometimes there are fields that are a mile or even 2 miles away from the river, from the source of the river. But remember, it's not going to rain enough here to support your crops. It's a very dry area. You have to have irrigation. You have to have a means by getting water from your water source, your river, your stream, to your crops. Now that can be fairly complex, can it not? You have to find out an area where it's relatively flat. You have to dig ditches. You have to have dikes. And you have to have somebody regulate who gets water to their fields when. This looks like an example like we perhaps see in Egypt rather than Mesopotamia. This illustration, obviously fanciful, would give us an indication that this is probably Egypt as well. But this is true of Mesopotamia too. You simply have to have dikes. You have to have ditches. You have to have the water flowing to certain places at certain times. You're not going to just be able to go out there and say, well, here my farm is 1,000 yards away from the stream, and now I'm going to get with my shovel or my stick or my hoe, and I'm going to take that out to my farm. That's impractical. It's too much work. What we need is a number of people doing this. Number of people have to benefit. See, you're not going to have a lot of people over here just to support my field. You have to have people that support large numbers of fields. So you bring people together. You just have, shall we say, everybody just throw out their opinion at any given time. Yeah, you can listen to what people are saying, but you're going to have some kind of organization. You're going to have the ability for people to sit down and say, look, we're going to all do this together. We're going to cooperate in this manner to get the water at places at various times. To do this, we expect everybody to participate. I'm not going to sit back here long ways from the river and say, not in the mood today, you people can come out, but yeah, I want the water anyway. No. You're going to have to cooperate. You're going to have to cooperate. If everybody's going to benefit, everybody has to participate. And in doing this, we can call this political, if you will. Because if one morning I decide, well, wait a minute, it's my turn to work on the ditch or to build the dike or to distribute the water, and I don't want to do it. You see, the other guys are going to come over and say, you're going to do it. Because we're not going to spend hours out here in the hot sun doing something to benefit you unless you participate as well. Sometimes you're going to end up with the head man. He's going to start telling people, all right, look, I have the biggest field. You do this, you do this, you do this. Another way of calling this is politics. Social organization, yes. But you have to have also the ability to get everybody to cooperate, and later on the ability to coerce people to do things. This is politics. So we believe that's very early. You have to have a political and social organization in order to function. I mentioned this before. I'll probably come back to it again. You see where we're at over here, specialization. When you get towns, you get communities. You have surplus crops. Now you have people that can do various things. You all don't have to do one thing. You can have people that specialize. Remember I mentioned you might have blacksmiths. You might have carpenters, somebody who makes pottery better than somebody else. And this allows for, shall we say, more goods and services and a larger spectrum of people doing different things. And a lot of that, of course, will end up being artistic in nature later on. I guess I'm kind of repeating myself here a little bit because I made a big deal about political and force. Yeah, force is part of a government. We do believe, do we not, that we live in a land of freedom, and we do. We're free to do a lot of things. Go for a walk, go to the park, marry whom we will. We have all kinds of freedoms. But we do not have freedom to break the law. The government makes laws. Outside of that, we can do what we want. But the government says, you're not going to walk on the grass at the park, or we're going to arrest you. Then you do not have the freedom to walk on the grass. I remember reading an autobiography of the country and western singer Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash, after a concert, went out in the park and he picked a flower. And the police come up and said, it's illegal to pick flowers in this park. So they took Johnny Cash and locked him up in jail all night long. That's the punishment. So he's free to do what he wanted to do, but he's not free to break the law. So we are restricted to a certain extent. But a lot of times we're willing to give up our freedoms, at least picking flowers, shall we say, in order to have protection, in order to have organization, which we get from our government. We get organized religion showing up at this time frame. Religion can be very personal. It's not uncommon this time frame for people to have what we call household gods. And sometimes they're carved out of wood. Sometimes if you have a very wealthy family, it might be carved out of stone. More often, river, mud, clay. You form this little image, and you put this image in your house. And you say this image has power. It's a god. and you do obeisance to it, and sometimes you put food and offerings in front of it so it knows that you're serious about worshiping it. Now, we can do all kinds of things personally, but wouldn't it be a good idea if we have an organized religion? In other words, we have a professional caste, if you want to call them, professional group. Early on, it's men and women, not just men. We do see a tendency over time for this to shift away, and women become, shall we say, lesser figures in most religions, while the males have a tendency to be, shall we say, more important. Organized religion. I can do all these things to try to get the gods on my side. But isn't it better if somebody does it for me? And then I remember farming is very hard work. You don't lounge around and have a good farm. No, you participate for many hours, sometimes day after day, in the kinds of things you have to do to bring in a good crop. Do you really have time to do that which is pleasing to the gods? But how about you have somebody or a group of people within your society, it's helpful if you're in a city, within your society that does the work for you, to appease the gods for you. So the gods will be happy to shine on the community. So it's not something you have to do personally. It's something that you do as a community. So you get organized religion. And these people, we'll talk more about this when we get to ziggurats. We have people that live certain restrictions. People that spend time praising the gods for the good of the community. Something else we get in this time frame is ownership. I should say stronger notions of ownership. You see, if I'm a hunting gathering society and I pick up some food off the ground that we're going to eat, well, it's mine, right? I have a toolkit. I've made my arrows, or I've made my hide scraper, and I put labor into it. Well, I own it. But remember, these people have a tendency to move around. Do they have a concept, a strong concept, should we say, that if I'm here at this riverbank, I'm catching some fish, or I'm at the bank of a lake catching turtles, something like this, that I actually own it? But see, I'll be here for a while, decide that I want to go someplace else. So the fact that I'm not moving around gives me an idea of ownership is, shall we say, a little bit looser. I don't really own the river. I just come to the river and I grab a few things. I don't own the berry patch, which I found over here, but I eat the berries and then I move on. But when I'm at one place, you do have a tendency to say, wait a minute, I have this ground right here, my fields. I plow it, I harvest it, I work on it for many hours, and I don't go any other place. After I get in concept, wait a minute, I own that. Before you have something largely based on use. But now when you're sitting and working on a plot of land, then you start feeling, start feeling very much strongly for ownership, that I'm owning this. I'm always amused by this old story. It's a good old story. Remember, the first people that came to New York were the Dutch. The name for New York originally was New Amsterdam. And when they came there, they bartered with the Indians to get the land. Now, remember, the Dutch have a very, very strong concept of land ownership, going back, well, thousands of years, at least many hundreds of years, where they owned plots of ground. So they come over to New York and they say, well, you own. So they barter with the Indians, according to the story. And in modern parlance, for about $24 worth of beads and trinkets. To you and me, it's worth nothing, right? Or very little. They bartered with the local people, saying, oh, by the way, we want to buy the island of Manhattan, which, as you all know, is the center of New York City. And the idea is that, well, talk about a bunch of charlatans. Nowadays, you look at New York, Manhattan, And this is among the most expensive land anywhere on the planet. And you bought it for a bunch of things that really matter not at all. Well, we sure took the Indians. However, let's look at it a little bit more from the Indian standpoint, from the native peoples. You see, they don't believe in ownership the way we do. You're there, you use it, right? You go someplace else, you use something else. It's like air. What would you do if somebody came up to you and said, hey, buddy, hey, lady, yes, I want to buy your air. You go, you want to buy my what? I want to buy your air. Sure. Make me an offer, $24 for your air. Absolutely. I think we have an agreed price. You can now have my air. See, we don't think in terms of owning air, do we? We think in using air. I have the right to air because I need air and I breathe. But the native peoples, it's the same thing with land. You don't own land, you use land. You don't own the Hudson River, you fish or hunt ducks out there, whatever you want to use the river for. So rather than saying the Dutch pulled one over on the Indians, maybe from the Indian standpoint, they pulled one over on the Dutch. A little caveat to that story, so I kind of think it's kind of interesting. When the Dutch were negotiating with the native peoples to buy it, it's actually, they were negotiating with the wrong people. They weren't negotiating with the people that are actually using that area. They're negotiating with people that were actually, shall we say, a little bit off to the side. In other words, it's like somebody come up and say, hey, I want to buy the Brooklyn Bridge. See, I don't own the Brooklyn Bridge, obviously. You want to give me some money for the Brooklyn Bridge? Absolutely. I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. $24 sold. Any of it. It's kind of a stupid story. All right, ownership. Ownership becomes very important. If you have cattle, if you have sheep, if you have a cat, you have a dog, you take care of it, you feed it, you pet it, it's yours. So it's not just land, it's also animals. Now we come to something else. To our modern ear and our modern sensitivity is really quite disturbing. And that is the idea of owning human beings. So ownership goes a little bit farther than you and I want to take it. I'm sure you know that slavery still exists in the modern world. Rather than being a major institution, many countries involved in it, in various continents. Slavery does exist in smaller numbers. Last time I read an article on this, probably 9-10 years ago, the article was speculating there are maybe 27 million slaves in the world today. Well, that's a very, very high number, but it's not nearly as large as it used to be. We are disturbed by that. We're disturbed by people being controlled by other people. We do find very early on in civilizations, that slavery is accepted. How did you go from ownership of a field or a cow or a goat to owning human beings? When we look at people being forced to work for other people, there's enormous gradations. Bond servants, people that have to work for people for a certain number of years. The severest form of slavery, however, is what we call chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is when you own something outright. You own everything about it. I look at this, and one of the good ways I suggest we might want to remember this is chattel looks a little bit like cattle, doesn't it? It's not the same term. But if we look at a chattel slave, we can think that the slave has about as much rights as a cow or any other animal you own. If you want to work your cow, your ox, you want to brand them, you want to kill them, you want to eat them, You want to torture them? Can the cow sue you in court? No, no, no. You own that animal outright, and it has no rights at all. If a cow doesn't own its body, a human being does not as well in chattel slavery. You don't even own your own body. In other words, if your master wants to abuse you like he beats his dog, he can do so. If he wants to overwork you like his ox, he can do that. If he wants to deny you food like his goat, he can do that. If he wants to kill you, he can do that. He owns you utterly and outright. Slavery is one of the ugliest forms of human society, and it exists before we have written records. It would be fascinating if, when slavery developed, that we had people there who could write and say, oh, this is the reason why it happened. This is why we have done these kinds of things. We don't have those records, but we do have some indication when people are talking about the nature of slavery later on, when there are written records, and we can logically maybe read this backwards. But let's see some of the theories as to how this happens. One of which is dire poverty. I mean, you can't support your family. It can be a famine, it can be a war, it can be a plague of locusts came in and ate everything you've got. And now what do? You can come to somebody who might have grain or money or resources to help you and say, okay, please allow me to live. And the person might say, well, I'll take your farm. Your farm's not worth anything. Or maybe they'll take your farm anyway. Do you have any cattle? Well, we already ate the cattle. That's why we're starving. Well, what do you have? What do you have that you can give me so I can give you the grain? How about your body? It can be that abrupt. We're starving. Feed us. I will sell you my body. I will sell you who I am. I will sell you my family, simply to survive. It can be, that can happen abruptly. It's a simple disaster. It can happen over time. You get into debt. Well, I can't afford to feed my family this year, so I'll borrow money. And after a while, I can't pay it off, or I can't pay the interest on it, so I borrow more money. And after a while, I'm just in a sea of debt. So what do? I sell my resources, and they can come down to my body. That's one theory. We do see this. This does happen when there are written records. So we know this is happening also at a later time frame. Another issue is this: what happens if you go to war? We'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But people go to war in the ancient world, sometimes for similar reasons than people go to war in the modern world. Dispute over land, dispute over property, dispute over trade. There might be some issues of I don't like your face, or I have a big ego to feel, or you people are a little bit different. I don't like your language. I don't like your attitude. So we go to war. Now, what happens if you're victorious? What happens if your army is better than their army? What do? And you win. You now have taken away the ability of these other people to defend themselves. And now you got these people, they're hostiles. Can we say they're hostile? I know, you killed my husband, and I'm not terribly happy about you controlling my community. What shall we do with these people we conquer? Why don't we kill all of them? That'll do away with the problem. You don't have to feed them, don't have to worry about them. They're not going to rebel, just kill them all. Prisoners of war, these men captured in battle. Let's kill them all. Wait a minute. Would it not be better if we use them as a labor force? We can take them, enslave them, and they work for us. We can take them and sell them to somebody else to work for them. They become an economic asset. There's a lot of trade in the ancient world in human beings going back and forth. Is this better than killing people? Yeah, I guess it is. Extremely interesting, making a contrast to what we do in the modern world. As you know, the Allies, including the United States, defeated Japan and Germany during the Second World War. We did not enslave, we didn't go in and kill everybody. We went in and pumped in a lot of money to Japan and to Germany, which made them viable, strong economies and democracies. And now they're among our best friends in the world. Unfortunately, ideas have histories too. We cannot say because that made sense to us, it's made sense to them. It did not. You really don't think in those terms that we should support our enemies to make them our friends. Now, slavery exists in every society we'll be discussing. In various areas and various times, it becomes major institutions. The major institution becomes a minor institution. In the Middle Ages, we have slavery. We always have slavery. But it's more minor because serfdom and later freedom becomes more common. We'll be discussing those issues later. So it is not my purpose this early in the course to have a very large discussion of the nature of slavery in the ancient world. I'm going to save that for one of our best examples of slave society, and that happens to be Rome. When we start discussing Rome, I will discuss the nature of slavery in Rome, and by extrapolation, we can see how in similarities it works in other societies as well. Let's talk about some clear civilizations now, not just a few cities here and there. Let's talk about Mesopotamia. I'm sure you all know that Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers. Well, let's take a look at Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is largely modern-day Iraq. Can I give you a better shot at that? Largely modern-day Iraq. Can you see the Tigris and Euphrates rivers? A little bit challenging. As I lean forward, I can see the two rivers coming down. What is a little bit challenging about this map is it has modern topographical features. By that I mean the Tigris and Euphrates rivers coming down here. According to this map, they meet. They do in the modern world. In the ancient world, they do not meet. As you all know from your studies of geography and geology, rivers tend to wash down sediment and you silt up areas. So in the ancient world, the extent, do I have another maps better than that? Yeah, that's a little bit better because you don't see the rivers coming together. That happens later on. So they're essentially separate. Land between the rivers, yeah. Sometimes people call this the cradle of civilization. Obviously, the indication of a cradle is that the cradle is where you have the birth. This is where civilization actually first took place. Well, back when I was about your age, back when I was in college, there was actually a debate among archaeologists saying that which is oldest, ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia. I kind of followed this, at least when it showed up in newspapers. Finally, the archaeologists way back then decided that Mesopotamia was actually older than Egypt. Remember, you got radiocarbon dating, and you're doing excavations in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. Finally decided it was older. Well, because of political reasons, remember Saddam Hussein, the Iraq wars, modern archaeologists really don't want to go over here. It's very, very dangerous. So the number of excavations has gone on over here has dwindled off quite considerably, while Egypt is still accessible for archaeology. I am going to go with what I was told, that Mesopotamia is actually older. but I will argue that Egypt might have been earlier. But we probably don't have a pretty good understanding about that until you can start doing large numbers of excavations in Iraq or Mesopotamia again. Some of the earliest areas, yes, very early. And even if you want to look at Egypt or Mesopotamia being older, one of the things I want to point out is that we do, when you get back very far, we do have a definitional problem. We know things are going on about the same time in Mesopotamia and Egypt, but are in reality, which aspect of civilization are we using to measure if civilization exists or not? When we talk about writing, we'll come back to that. Well, the earliest civilization in Mesopotamia is Sumer. Get some Sumer for you out here. Persian Gulf. I'd like to get a bigger map. We can see some of the cities around here. They're the cities within the, oh, that's not so good. We get the cities along the river. I'll come back to talk about writing in a little while. These people could write. So as we look at them, we can look at linguistic groups. You see, if you look at, so we say Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian, and you look at, you see large similarities in grammatical constructions, but in words. And you say, aha, looking at this, I think there's a pretty good indication these languages are related to each other. If you look at something like English, and you look at Dutch, you see a lot of similarities. So Dutch, German, English are actually cousin languages. So English is by and large a Germanic language. We can tell this by similarities. I was told it goes like this. In Germany, the word for 5 is fünf. In Dutch, the Dutch word for 5 is vier. In English, it's 5. Can you see the similarities? They're clearly there. Now, if you can read a language, you can say, looking at word choices, are they related to each other? I happen to know a little bit, some Hebrew. Probably a telemarketer, excuse me. Hello. It says I can afford my health insurance. I do apologize for that. I'm not sure I want to turn off my phones, however, because in doing so, if something actually important did come in, I would have an opportunity to respond. Now, let's go back to Sumer. We can tell languages are related to each other by word use. I do know a little bit of Hebrew. The word for man in Hebrew is ish. The word for woman in Hebrew is isha. Does that sound like man and woman? In no sense, does it? Is modern English related to Hebrew? I don't think so. My goodness. Maybe my wife got that one. I hope she did. Okay. As looking at Hebrew, looking at Sumer. See, I did it already. I warned you in the first lecture. I'll be thinking one thing and I'll say something else. Okay, think about Sumer. Linguistically, Sumer is not related to any known language or linguistic group. We say, therefore, they're a mystery people. Yeah, where did they come from? We don't know. If they're not related to anybody else, it's very hard to make an argument, is it not? That they came from the same places other people came from. Well, language not related to any other. Farming, yeah. Uh, Mud brick, you tend to use materials that are nearby and accessible in your building. If you're living in the plains, you tend to not to make your houses out of wood because wood is not nearby. Same thing is true in Mesopotamia. You're not making your houses out of wood because the wood is available, but it's up in the mountains. Are you going to go up there, cut down cut down trees and bring the wood down? Probably not. It's just not efficient. Something else. You're probably not going to use a lot of stone. Mud is easy to get. You go down by the river. You take it out and they have a frame for this. And what you can do is you take the river mud, throw it in a frame. You have to level it out. Let it sit in the sun. And a good hot day down there, it can be well over 100 degrees. And let it dry, and then you remove the frame and you got a brick. You can use that for a lot of things, to build buildings primarily. One of the difficulties with looking and doing archaeology in Mesopotamia is that this is not your more sturdy form of building materials. Over time, it's going to crumble. Over time, it does rain occasionally, right? It's going to weather down somewhat. So a lot of times when you do excavations in ancient Mesopotamia, you actually have these mounds. And because the stone, I shouldn't call it stone, the mud brick has sloughed off. Now, like pottery, they do realize if you take mud brick and you put it in a kiln and you fire it, then it becomes very, very hard and very durable. When you have mud brick that's been made into something like pottery, it can be very durable. But that's expensive, and you got to get the fuel to do that. But they're using what's handy. Irrigation. Irrigation is very important. So I've already talked about organization, force, government. Since we can read their writing, it's quite fascinating that as we see themes that actually resonate with us. There is an epic, which I'll discuss in a little while, called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is looking for his friend. And he's got to cross the rivers. We obviously would think this is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers up here. And he talks to a boatman. And the boatman talks about going across the river. And the man, his name is Shamash Napishtim. And Shamash Napishtim tells Gilgamesh about the flood. There was a flood, and the flood was so deep, and the water rose. And we find that the entire land was covered with it. You couldn't even see the edge of the river. And he was in a boat. He's a boatman that goes across the river. So he has something that floats. Essentially, he's on a ferry. He took animals on it. And for a number of days, he's floating around until the water starts to recede. Similar to Noah? Yes, it is. The one that I find, shall we say, most interesting is Tabi Ultul Enlil. Tabi Ultul Enlil is a story about a man. It's somewhat similar to the story of Job, which we happen to see in the Bible. Remember when you were paying attention, little boy, little girl, to the pastor, the priest, the reverend, who was ever teaching the Sunday school class? Remember he or she told you in the book of Job, we have a man. It's this guy. This guy has one of the finest compliments paid anybody in the Bible. He's called a perfect man. Now that's a compliment. Does everything right. He has, shall we say, the worst day in the history of the Bible. His crops are run away. His animals die. His children are dead. And worse comes to worse. then he gets sores all over his body. And his wife's still alive, but she comes and rags on this guy. He has friends coming to talk to him. Job, you are a rat. You are being punished because you acted like you were a human being. You acted like you were a good guy, but in reality, you were a bum. You did all these bad things. We just don't know about them. See, it's justice that you're being punished. Job says, I'm sorry, I didn't do all these things. He said, yeah, sure you did, pal. He's got nobody to turn to. He's got nothing. Now, why is this interesting? One of the more perplexing moral questions we see in the ancient world, we see it in the modern world today, is why do bad things happen to good people? Is it not fair? Is it not just that good things should come to good people? But that doesn't always happen, does it? So they're struggling with an idea that we also see in the Bible and is also challenging even for us today. Togtuk. How do we explain this world we live in, which is very challenging? I have to get up in the morning. I have to go out and take care of the crops. I work all the time. The idea was there were gods. The gods like to live with man. And the gods were good to man. And the gods created good food for man. You didn't have to go out and work all the day in the fields. You just lived around it. It was on the trees. And, it was on the bushes. You had nice, good food. So how do we get from that condition to the condition we're in now? Because there's a rebellion among human beings. I'm not going to say that these stories are identical to what we have in the Bible, but I am going to say some of the same kinds of questions that we find being addressed in the Bible are being addressed in a much earlier time frame by the people in Mesopotamia. And some of these questions, in this case, Tabi Utul Enlil, resonate even today. So they're very much like us. The first monumental architecture, ziggurats. I'm not sure if I'm telling you, I don't want to be overly simplistic in my discussion of this, because we find large architecture in a lot of places, really outside of Mesopotamia. Recently on the island of Malta in the Mediterranean, archaeologists have recognized, and it's relatively crude by the standards of Mesopotamia, some very large structures, really piled up stone, that probably go back to the Neolithic. I'm sure you're all familiar with Stonehenge. Stonehenge is also very old, about the same time frame. Can we say that's that's monumental architecture? In the sense that there's a lot involved, yes it is. Now one thing that's a little bit different between Stonehenge and what we see in ziggurats is Stonehenge, and was a circle of stones. Since I mentioned it, maybe I better remind you what I'm talking about. This reminds you've all seen this. Would you call it monumental? Probably would. But from the standpoint you're building up, this is different. And there are a lot of debates among archaeologists exactly how this was used. In any event, let's go back to the ziggurats. The ziggurats are a pretty good form of construction if you're using something like mud brick, which is not as rigid. When we talk about the Egyptians can build in stone going up because stone is very strong. Mud brick isn't nearly as good. So you kind of pile it up more than build it directly up. First monumental architecture, among those. Well, some of these things can be 200-300 feet high. They're really, let's see, there's been modern reconstructions done under Saddam Hussein. They essentially show them what they looked like. Before they started reworking on these, remember, you do have a tendency for these things to be slough off a little bit because of the nature of the building materials. But however, and I do not recommend that anybody go to Iraq right now on a tour to look at these things because the political situation is so unstable. But you do get an idea of what they were like. Large stair steps, can go over this one. Large, so you can come up here, several levels as you can see. And you have a little box up here, a little building on top of this, where the priests and the priestesses had a tendency to live. Well, why do you build these things? One of the reasons, of course, is if you want to show the gods that in fact, you are serious. You want to worship him in a hut. Here we are, we love you gods, but we're not going to show off in any real sense. No, you want to have something that's a little bit more elaborate. There's another issue. You get closer to the gods. You see, in modern religions, we have a tendency to believe that the deity can read our thoughts. You see, to a certain extent back then, they're believing that the gods are just kind of like superhuman beings, and they have ears. If you do not speak up, they're not going to hear you. Prayer back then very commonly was the hands are up. Can't see it on this. The hands are up. You turn up, say, "Oh Lord!" You scream, yell, so they'll hear you. If you're closer to them, they hear you better. If you're closer to them, they see you better. If you're up a couple 300 feet and they're up in the sky and they look down and you go, "Oh, I can see these people, what they're doing down here." We do have a tendency to believe that deity lives in the sky. Now, these people are polytheistic. They believe there's gods in all kinds of things. There's gods in the river. There's gods in the trees. There's gods in the wind. But the most important gods, that are more important than all these other gods, ahead of these are the sky gods. And the most important object, as you know, in the sky is the sun. The sun god to the ancient Mesopotamians was Marduk. Marduk's the sun god, lives up there. In Egypt, and Egypt likes a lot of times not just simple one god, they like double gods and triple gods, triune gods. But Ra is the sun god in Egypt, and Ra is the most important of them all. So you want to worship, you want to get closer to God. That's another issue as well. We see this in other areas. I'm sure you're familiar with the ancient Greeks. We'll talk about them later. They believe that the abode of the gods is Mount Olympus. Mount Olympus happens to be the highest mountain in Greece. So remember, in Greece, the gods aren't even terribly moral sometimes. Like big people, and they're jealous and they don't get along with each other. But they still live in a high, high place. We see this in the ancient Hebrews. When Moses goes up to receive the word of the Lord, he goes to Mount Sinai. One of the greatest of all Christian sermons comes from Jesus. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. See, we do have a tendency to think that which is important tends to be high. So this is not terribly surprising. In ancient society, of course, the political leader is very, very important. But also, it's very, very important to have a religious leader. Sometimes, since the religious leader is dealing with the gods, sometimes they're actually more important than the guy ordering armies around. Sargon. I just mentioning him. As far as we know, he's probably the first world conqueror. We're going to see this later on. You're going to see Alexander the Great. In the modern time frame, you have people like Napoleon. We are familiar with the people who like to take large areas of ground. The world conqueror to him is not like world conqueror is to us. See, Sargon, let me get back here to, Sargon actually just controls the lower part of Mesopotamia down here. But we do have people getting together, ambitious people. You conquer one city, you conquer another city. Then after a while, you finally have a political entity, which is your empire in this case. Writing. I've referred to this in a couple of contexts. Remember, how do we know about Shamash Napishtim, Tabi Utul, Enlil, and Togtug is because they were written down. Now, writing. Writing has a demonstrable evolution to memory aids and then to a complete written system. Advanced memory aids. Do we use memory aids? I use them. I'm getting kind of old, and jogging had to give a long time ago because my knees were giving me grief. But a long time ago when I was down at the track or the gym doing laps, it's very easy to get confused because if you're thinking about, okay, I've just done 3 laps, and you think, well, next lap is 4. Well, wait a minute, have I done 3 or have I done 4? It can be very confusing, particularly when your legs start to ache. You say, well, wouldn't it be nice if I had another lap behind me rather than having to run that again. So I ended up with a simple memory aid. It's very, very simple. It's not writing at all, believe me. 1 lap, put my thumb between my first finger. I pass a certain point, that's the lap. 2, put my thumb between the next finger. 3, put my thumb between that finger. 4, 5. You see, and then of course after 5, then you go to the other hand. You see, I find it convenient to use very, very simple memory aids. And that's what these people are doing initially. Now, if you have mud, and there's a lot of mud, you can use memory aids. You can pat a stick, for example. Throw a stick on the ground, which reminds you that you have 1 sheep or something like this. But how about doing that in mud? You can take a stick and throw it around pretty easily and get yourself confused. But if you have a slab of mud and you, rather than having a stick on the ground, you draw a picture of a stick. Well, a stick, as you know, if you want to do it, it kind of has 4 sides. Looks something like that. Why don't we stylize it? Just go, have 1 line, means 1 thing. As time goes by, you can end up with very, very complicated symbols written on clay to mean very complicated ideas. Advanced memory aids. So, memory tokens about the 9th millennium BC. Somebody's got pictographs. Oh, let's see. A pictograph, I'd like to show you one here, which may or may not work. Okay. If you have something like, if you want to, shall we say, talk about that which is in the heavens, how about draw a star? Stars are in the heavens. This is a little bit more sophisticated, as you can see, because we have a wedge, but sometimes initially they were just lines going back and forth, just up and down. Well, okay, so you wanted to pick star, that is a good way of doing it. Some person could come by, doesn't even know the language, look at that and say, yeah, it probably means star. However, what goes on in the sky? That's where the gods live. That's where the important gods live. So can that mean heaven? Yes, it can. You see, now we've shifted from something that looks like something to an ideogram, an idea. It can mean heaven. It can mean an afterlife. It can have all of these kinds of things. Cuneiform is wedge-shaped writing. It's very complicated. Can I give you some more examples here? Yeah. Notice you have fish here. Here's my star, actually. Can I get larger than that? Yeah. So you can get star, and then you have all these kinds of things. which over time, you have fish that kind of looks like a fish. After a while, it doesn't look like a fish at all. And the star, as you can see, becomes more and more stylized. It's very complicated. This is not something like you and I can do when you were young. You can sit down and learn the alphabet when you're a child, learn sound systems, and as a child you can use the signs, sound them out, and you can read. Small children can do this. This is a system, however, that's going to take a small group of people, a lengthy period of time. In other words, this can take you years to master this. Why is it wedge-shaped writing? If you take some clay, take some mud, take a reed stylus, and doing things, even though we have an example of here of some curves involved, that's cumbersome. And sometimes it just simply pushes the part of the clay off to one side. But taking a stylus where you simply press and you maybe pull a line here a little bit, then you have the ability to write better with the medium at hand. Since the Egyptians are going to write on papyrus using inks, they can be more elaborate. But if you're using something like this as a memory aid, using mud, then this is about as good as you're going to do. Very complicated. Use of syllables. Have you ever noticed that? We used to play little games like this when I was a kid. Have you ever noticed that you can, if you know a language, can you write something without the use of vowels? We used to do that kind of thing. It's kind of fun, actually. If you have like RN, I could write RN on the board. We can't do this because we're not in a classroom, but I write RN on the board. I turn to your students and say, what's that word? You'd say run or ran. See, what's challenging in run and ran is that without the vowel, you can't say it's present or past tense. But in context, you got a number of words, you'll be able to understand if it is in present or in the past tense. But you don't need the vowel. So they tend to use syllables. Tend to use syllables without the vowel. Syllables, as you know, is a group of sounds, group of words. Writing. This is initially something that you simply use. Okay. This is something that you simply use for economic reasons. I have been told in looking at the various numerous forms of stones, well, I shouldn't call them stones, they start at clay tablets. Later on, if you put them in a kiln, then they do become virtually like a stone. If you take these kinds of things and you read them, a very large majority, 80, 90% of these things, in fact, are economic. You know, pigs, chickens, probably not as many chickens yet, pigs, cattle, grain, wine, all these kind of things. Now, we can say this probably developed initially, at least in this case, to try to keep track of economic transactions. However, the system, give you a better idea what I'm talking about. However, the system is a complete system. It was designed, in all likelihood, for economic reasons. But when you have it, you can now use all kinds of different things with it. Writing has an enormous impact. It's almost impossible to exaggerate its impact in the world. We actually find the troubled teenager in ancient Sumer. It's like this. Dad comes to the son and says, "What are you doing?" "Nothing, Dad. I'm not doing anything." "Then why do you idle about? Get home and study your lessons." The troubled teenager. Women are going to go on a date. Well, you got to have the proper coiffure. You have to have the proper makeup. They say these kinds of things as well. The enormity of this should not be understated. Writing is so important that some historians have argued that analysis is impossible without writing. If you try to keep every argument in your brain and then come out with something new, that can be extremely challenging. And when you do so, how do you know you're building on something that's unique? People are very clever and we have very strong memories. But to make intellectual advances, you really have to have the ability to write. You have to have the ability to record things. Most important advance for ideas, I'm going to argue that very strongly. Makes long memory analysis possible. We can actually go back and you can, well, I guess you can't really talk to them, but they can talk to you. You can sit down with Plato, who lived close to 2,500 years ago, and listen to what he tells you about his ideas and thoughts. Whoa. You can sit down and talk, you can't talk to him, and listen to people in the Bible. The Bible's older than Plato. Bible's older than Aristotle. And have these people tell you about their culture, their ideas, and their religion. That's tremendous what you can do. It's impossible without writing. All those kinds of things that's gone on before would literally be lost unless you had the ability to read some written records. As time goes by, and writing systems eventually, particularly when we get the alphabet, become more and more simplistic, we can teach people how to read and write ever so much more easily. When you do that, you can have the potential of a little explosion of ideas. Can we actually say that without writing, civilization is always going to be very, very modest? It is simply going to be limited. With writing, civilization can explode. It can go to all kinds of different places and carry all kinds of meaning. Should never underestimate the impact of this. Well, we go back, and it's not my purpose to go back and talk about every civilization. Sumer comes first. We have the Babylonians, and we have the Akkadians, and we have the Neo-Babylonians, and we eventually have the Persians. In the same area, people come in and conquer. It's not my purpose to really give you a description of all of that, because this is a survey course and not a course directly dealing with Mesopotamia. But we say, okay, we've got writing, we've got organization. Unfortunately, we've got slavery. But how does these very lengthy time frames actually influence us? Well, like I say, they are addressing a few ideas that you and I think are important, like why do bad things happen to good people? But let's look at a few other things as well. It's not that these people are so far back they don't influence us, because they do. From Babylon, remember we have Sumer and Babylon. The Babylonians speak a Semitic language, which is related to modern day Arabic and also modern day Hebrew. So that is the linguistic group. So they're not a mystery people. We have a pretty good idea who they are, or who they were in this case. What do we get from them? Well, we get the 7-day week. I like the 7-day week very, very much. Why? Because they're Saturday and they're Sunday. Why 7 days? Remember, before you have cities, which you and I are very familiar with, you have what we call light pollution. You walk outside and you look up, you don't see anything but black, because the street lamps and the other lights that are on block you out. You can't see. But if you're in a situation where you don't have few flames, but very little light after dark, and it goes down, there's very little pollution too. Boy, the panorama of the sky can be enormous. Once again, you're spending an awful lot of time admiring the objects in the sky, including the moon, the stars, and the planets. 7-day week. If we were in a classroom, I would ask people, well, why do we have a 7-day week? And some people say, well, it's in the Bible. Yes, it is. All right. But it's actually a little bit earlier than that. Let's look at our names. What is Saturday named after? Saturn. What's Sunday named after? The sun. What's Monday named after? The moon. Are we seeing a pattern? Yeah, we are. If you look in the sky, what's the most important object? Sun. So it's the first day of the week, right? So, and then look at the other important things. What's the next most important thing in the sky? Well, the moon. Okay. So you have the sun. Let's count them, right? The sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. That's why you have 7. Very important number. Later on, the Christians are going to use this for the 7 cardinal virtues, excuse me, and the 7 deadly sins. A very important number. Since these days of the week are named after celestial objects, I'm very, very happy that they didn't know about Uranus and Neptune. I want to put Pluto on here as well. The difficulty is in the recent years, when I was growing up, we had 9 planets, including Pluto. The difficulty with this is that Pluto has been demoted. It's no longer a planet, it's a planetoid. Be that as it may, I'm really glad they didn't know about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Because rather than having a 7-day week, you might have a 10-day week. 10-day weeks, I don't like 10-day weeks. Could you imagine, get up Monday, and Monday you say, well, I got 5 days to the weekend. What if it was 8 days to the weekend? Whoa! I've read, I guess it might be true, I've read that suicides are higher on Mondays than on Friday. Why would that be? Monday is tempted to end it all because you got 5 more days. Friday, nah. At least I got a reason to live for the next couple of days. If you had it out that long, could you imagine how depressing that would be to wake up Monday morning going, oh my goodness, we have to do it all over again. Anyway, that's something that they developed and something that is used even today. The 12-hour day and the 60-second minute and the 60-minute hour for that matter. The 12-hour day. Why would we have a 12-hour day? Our system, our numerical system, as you well know, is based on a system of 10. 10 makes perfect sense to me because as I hold out my fingers and my thumbs, it's very easy to count to 10. I remember I asked a lady who had a PhD in anthropology, being that very obvious you would have something like this. He says, well, you're being too narrow. I said, what do you mean? He says, why do you have to count the fingers? Some societies don't count the integers. They count the spaces between them. Wow, I hadn't thought about that. So rather than 5 on this side, I'd have 4. And 5 on this side, I'd have another 4. Well, our system, logically anyway, we're using. Can I tell you, they were talking about systems. Anthropologists got in a place like New Guinea, talking to native peoples there. And they're talking about, they asked one man, can you list the name of rivers in your area? And the guy goes, sure. And he goes, thinking this or this or this. Then you get 5. And can you see my wrist? He goes 6, 7, 8. I mean, if you talk to people and go like that, you go, what, you got a bump on your shoulder? 8. Anyway, you don't have to do it this way. But logically thinking, the 10 is the only acceptable way of looking at this, is somewhat short-sighted. Let's look at the structure of 12. Remember, these people have calculators. You need a numerical system that works very well to make calculations. Let's take 10. What can you do to 10? 10 will equally divide by 2. Will it equally divide by 3? No. 4? No. It will 5, but it won't 6. If you want to do simple calculations, 12 is your best number. It equally divides by 2, by 3, by 4, and by 6. It's very easy to manipulate this. And 12 becomes a very important number. 12 tribes of Israel is a good example of a very important number that is associated with 12. Now, 12-hour day, yeah, when the sun's up. You're not going to calculate this at night. Why? The sun goes down, yeah, you look at the stars and say, I got to get up and work tomorrow morning. Very commonly, farmers do go to bed when the sun goes down. So you go outside, you look up, and you say, well, okay, it's night, I'm going to bed. Well, later on, when you have more lamps, little lamps where you simply have oil in there and have a little wick, and you can stay up late in the night. If you're not a farmer, don't have to get up every morning to work all day, you can stay up in the night. So how about just have 12 hours in the night? Divide it the same way. So the 12-hour day. Now, let's take the idea of 12 and expand it just a little bit. Because if you're talking about 12 as something that's very easy to manipulate, how about 60? Is 60 easy to manipulate? It is, what's that, 5 12s. It will be easily divided by 2, by 3, by 4, by 5, by 6. Whoa. See, one of the reasons why our globes have 360 degrees is you just multiply it out by 6 and you have 360 degrees. So once again, it is a very convenient number to manipulate. Even though we do love the 10, even modern day navigation still using 360 degrees. And that's something that goes back very old. Well, we have writing. We have the first monumental architecture. We have the first monumental literature, and that's the Gilgamesh. We said the earliest forms around 2000 BC. It's been found in numerous archaeological sites, not always complete. A lot of them are, in fact, fragments. But the number of them found in numerous places, we can argue that this has got to be very popular. Certainly it was. Can we say that that as we look at our literature, as we read novels or we have drama, of course, on TV, we have movies as well, we tend to see certain aspects of our society reflected in what we're reading and what we see. Yes, it doesn't resonate to us unless it is something within our cultural matrix or our social matrix that we can relate to. And it is pessimistic. Am I out of time already? Wow, I'm sure getting there. I'm much out of time. Well, as I always like to say, the day I start, I'm 2 weeks behind. Well, I need to be farther than this, but I'll have to pick up with this later on. In any event, we will come back and discuss Gilgamesh in the next lecture. We'll go on and talk about a few other things. In the meantime, enjoy your day, and I appreciate you staying with me. Goodbye now.